Hi everybody, and a really warm welcome. Today we're delighted to share the launch of our 2026 Geostrategic Outlook. Now we've been publishing these geostrategic outlooks for nearly 8 years now. In each of those 8 years, we've identified the top 10 issues that we believe are impacting the global business community, but also policymakers and government entities throughout the world. And so in 2026, we do the same thing. We identify our top 10 developments that we think those individuals and those organizations should be focusing on. We're going to do one thing slightly differently this year, though. As well as hearing about those top 10 issues, we're going to move around the globe and hear from 4 of my colleagues in the Geostrategic Business Group for their take on what all of this means for the region and wider area that they're operating in. But let's start with those top 10 developments. Courtney, you are our Global Insights Leader and you're based in Washington, D.C. What are those top 10 and what are some of the big themes that unify the 10? Courtney, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, always. So, as you said, I'll do sort of the whirlwind tour now, just to give everybody a sense of what we see coming in 2026. So, basically, we've oriented our outlook around 3 key themes. So, the first is new rules and norms for business. So, policymakers are continuing to deepen their efforts to direct economic activity in 3 main ways. First, state interventionism. Governments are trying to enhance their country's economic security using policy tools such as industrial subsidies and local investment mandates, among other things. Number 2 is what we're calling trade under pressure. So basically, we think trade policy volatility isn't over. We expect new trade policies to be enacted in 2026 that will seek to modify supply chains and trade patterns around the world. And then number 3 is sovereign AI and cyber conflicts. So governments are increasingly treating AI assets as a national security priority and an important piece of critical infrastructure for their economies more broadly. And at the same time, of course, AI could serve as a force multiplier of cyber conflicts. The second big theme is geopolitics of scarcity. So we highlight 3 scarce resources, sort of broadly defined. Number 4 development is water scarcity. So we think challenges are likely to accelerate due to geopolitical competition for digital sovereignty and the growth of the AI industry, as well as due to climate change and water-related hazards. So we do expect governments to invest in water infrastructure, but there could be trade-offs required across some industries. Then number 5 is the critical minerals rush. So a variety of critical minerals are really necessary for strategic sectors, including digital technologies, high-capacity batteries, and defense systems. So governments will continue to try to gain or retain access to those critical minerals, which is likely to lead to new production and trade patterns. Then number 6 is debt, capital, and currencies. So essentially here we have geopolitical competition and the growing politicization of capital allocation that are really reshaping the global financial system. So we see sovereign debt issuance at an all-time high, even as debt servicing costs grow and fiscal deficits persist. So this could risk crowding out private investment and keeping long-term interest rates structurally higher. Then our third theme is what we're calling spheres of engagement, which is essentially a recognition that there will be 4 key regions in which all of these geopolitical dynamics play out over the course of 2026. So policy volatility in North America is likely to affect supply chains and investment opportunities there. In the Asia Pacific, a focus on economic security may create regional economic opportunities. Europe is at a crossroads regarding both its national security and its economic competitiveness. And then finally, geopolitical recalibration in the Middle East could accelerate economic competition and sort of shape the opportunities that we see in that region. So that's the quick roundup of our 2026 geostrategic outlook. Back to you, Ollie.
Thank you, Courtney. So 10 really interesting issues. And as you sort of briefly mentioned, 4 of those are regions. And that's a little bit of a departure for us, isn't it? I think for the last 4 or 5 years, we've not mentioned a region as one of the top 10, but we've explained how each of the 10 will affect each of the regions. But we really did feel that this feels different from different countries, from different regions. And that's why in something of a departure from our recent past, we have identified these 4 regions as really, really important. And so what we're going to do now is hear from each of those regions, each of those areas of the globe where geopolitics is playing out in some very similar but also some very different ways. So let's do that and bring in some colleagues from the Geostrategic Business Group who are based around the world. So to start with, and I think we're going to start with the East and then broadly travel west. So we're going to start with our Asia Pac leader, Nobuko Kobayashi. So Nobuko, welcome to this session. And our theme for APAC this year is centered around economic security. So please tell us a little bit more about economic security and how it's impacting the APAC region more generally.
Sure. Economic security has been a key word over the last couple of years, and it is actually one of the top agenda for the current administration in Japan as well. It is particularly prominent topic in APAC because many nations in APAC are very trade dependent, and we benefited a lot from the globalization trend. Now, unfortunately, some of the trade practices are taken as a tool of in the geopolitical power game, and there's economic coercion that we see exercised by some nations. So the rare earth minerals comes to my mind, for instance. So therefore, the sovereignty and then the economic security of a nation is floating to the top of a national agenda. This means that the obvious sectors such as obvious life critical sectors such as food, energy, or even like a digital infrastructure such as undersea cable are very critical to ensure the security of a nation. But also it reaches to fundamental sectors that would be supporting all the other industries of a nation, for instance, a semiconductor industry. So for this reason, Japan, for instance, which fell out of the semiconductor race in the 90s and 2000s, is trying to come up with a more of a made in Japan semiconductor industry. Now, this does not mean that countries such as Japan needs to go at it alone to secure the necessary supply and resilience of critical industries. This means this is not an autarky back in the Edo period, but this is a thoughtful collaboration and building supply chain resilience with other countries. In the case of semiconductor, for instance, the Taiwanese major suppliers are building factories in Kyushu, which is the southern part of Japan, for instance. So this will be good for Japan in terms of producing semiconductors on our land, and this is a good diversification strategy for the company as well. So we will see more of these cases of collaboration, and this can be understood in the context of economic security.
Thank you, Nobuko. Really interesting comments and a really important reminder that the APAC region is really, really important geopolitically, and it sometimes has flown underneath the headlines in the last year or so. And I think it's really important that we put it back up at the top of people's radars, no question. So let's keep moving further west, and we're going to move to the Middle East now, and we're going to be joined by my colleague, Tony O'Sullivan. So, Tony, the Middle East has had a very complicated and difficult year. Tell us a little bit more about the Middle East and how it fits into the global picture in 2026.
Thanks. 2025 was an interesting year in the Middle East. Obviously, we had a number of regional conflicts. We had some changes in diplomatic postures around the region, and we continued to be in a very much an evolving economic landscape. We expect 2026 will continue to have some of the geopolitical risks that we've seen in 2025 and some of the uncertainties, but we also see a lot of opportunity for investment in the region due to some of the strategies that the governments are taking here. The interesting thing that we've seen in the last 12 months in the Middle East is that as we've seen other parts of the world become less integrated economically, we actually see large MENA economies double down on foreign investment, both in the level of investments that they're making into other parts of the world, but also significantly the amount of investment that they're now attracting into the region from the US and from Europe and from the Far East. So we will continue to see regional governments walk a carefully chosen path in the next 12 months, we suspect, strengthening US economic links while also continuing to pursue deeper ties elsewhere. A couple of interesting topics when it comes to sort of investment. Firstly, I think the race for AI competitiveness has really generated a lot of investment within the region, and Middle East governments are looking to be leaders in that space. So if you look at the AI ecosystem at the moment, you have the US, you have the China, and I think the UAE and Saudi in particular are positioning MENA as being the sort of the third peg of the tripolar world in AI. We've seen some regional companies that are really taking a lead in the whole AI industry and the AI ecosystem. And we've also seen how state-backed capital through sovereign wealth funds can drive a lot of investment in that area in other parts of the world through investment vehicles such as MGX and Abu Dhabi. We've seen a lot of interaction between the US and the region in the last 12 months around investment. So, following a number of high level visits, we've now counted up around $3 trillion worth of investment commitments from governments in this region to invest into the US in coming years. Again, in areas such as infrastructure, transport, logistics, AI, data centers. But we're also seeing a lot of spend within the region, particularly in infrastructure. So if we look at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they're investing a lot in the tourism industry at the moment. They're investing a lot in mega projects to both cover for some underinvestment in the past, but also as their economy opens up, just to allow for greater opportunity for investment to come into the kingdom. And it's not just the GCC countries. So, for example, in Syria, with the change in regime 12 months ago, the relief on Western sanctions and export controls, we've seen how the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey have been getting close to the government in Damascus, and they're expected to lead efforts to capitalize on commercial opportunities that may arise from the reconstruction of Syria in the next 12 months. So looking ahead to 2026, while we do see that some of the geopolitical uncertainty in the last 12 months will continue to be in place, we also see a lot of opportunity within the region, given some of the government strategies around investment, particularly in infrastructure and particularly in industries such as AI and that wider ecosystem. So 2026 will continue to be an interesting year in MENA.
Thank you, Tony. Really interesting set of perspectives, and we will continue to watch the events in the Middle East and how they interact with the rest of the world with real interest. So now turning to Europe, slightly further west, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Famke Krummeler, our Europe lead, who's based out of Paris. Famke, over to you. What does this complicated world look like from a European perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. So from my European perspective, let's say, I would say that Europe is actually in a really tough spot right now and will continue to be throughout the next year. And to just summarize, I think what's going on is that the world in which the European model, as I would call it, so the one based on multilateralism, on trade, on the rule of law, etc., was successful, is changing so fundamentally and so quickly that Europe is actually struggling to keep up. And so looking forward towards 2026, as Courtney already mentioned, I think we will really be at a crossroads. There will be two aspects to this. The first one is Europe will be in a situation where it will continue to try to respond to the external challenges on the security front. So this is around the war in Ukraine, hybrid warfare, etc., but also on the competitiveness front. So questions around the relationship with China, Europe's own competitiveness, how to be less dependent on other parts of the world, etc. And then the second aspect of Europe's crossroads, let's say, will be around the fact that whether Europe will actually be successful will really critically depend on its internal dynamics, internal divisions between member states, and some critical elections that we will see in 2026, such as in Hungary. So there will be a lot of activity in Europe, legislative activity, trying to reduce the administrative burdens for businesses, etc. But in my view, Europe is just about kind of growing up from taking its first baby steps with regards to its response on how it plans to be successful in this new geopolitical environment that it faces. And the reason that I'm putting it that way is that from what I see talking to businesses in Europe, I think they are actually in a similar position. So taking the first baby steps, but much more can be done. And so thinking about the business situation, this is also the sense that I get is that many businesses are now beginning to realize, okay, this uncertainty that we've now been seeing for years is not going to go away. We need to do some structural changes and be better set up to actually navigate this environment. And I think that's exactly right. This is what needs to be done right now. In my view, businesses need to think about whether they have the right internal governance and expertise in order to deal with this environment. And then when we look at the European developments, I would say make sure that you're very well set up to understand how this external environment, and I just cited a couple of things and there's many, so how you can cut through this noise and really distill the ones that will be impactful for you. And then you will probably conclude that you need to invest into resilience and cybersecurity with the degrees of hybrid warfare, for example, going on in Europe, but more generally that you need to be prepared for crisis and for disruption. And at the same time, you might identify opportunity in sectors where there's policy-driven opportunities, as is the case in certain strategic sectors. So I would conclude for both the EU and for European business, it's not too late to act, but it's kind of now, and it needs to be bold. And I think this is what will be very critical for both constituencies, let's say, next year.
Thank you, Femke. And I love your phrase, Europe at the crossroads. And I think the path that Europe chooses to travel this year will have global consequences, both in terms of geopolitics, but also for businesses who are both headquartered in Europe, but also operate or sell into or manufacture in Europe as well. So for sure, a region that is worth watching very, very closely. And so finally, we're going to skip across the Atlantic and head to North America. And we're going to join Adam Barbina, our US geostrategy leader, who's based in New York. Adam, the North America has been a source of volatility, I think, over the last 12 months or so. So tell us a little bit about 2026 and how you're seeing that.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. I mean, I think you said it right there that, North America in the past year has faced significant political and policy volatility. This was in part driven by, initial U.S. trade policy, but we also saw other, kind of uncertainties or volatility, such as Canada's election results. In 2026, right, I think the answer is that volatility will continue. We're going to see Canada and Mexico particularly, respond to evolving U.S. policies, but also their own domestic challenges. What will also continue to drive both kind of policy in the U.S. but also elsewhere is that the U.S. is likely to pursue kind of two major prongs. One is further deregulation, and we've seen this particularly in energy and technology, but also other sectors. And this will likely create kind of new investment opportunities. Second, though, is kind of U.S. investment and industrial policy. And so that's explored in kind of the state interventionism topic that Courtney mentioned at the top of her review. Two other topics that are really important to kind of North America are one, the review of the U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, which is likely to, introduce more national security provisions that we've been seeing. And so that's going to kind of impact kind of trade dynamics as well as potentially disrupt supply chains. And so that's a really important area to focus. And particularly we're seeing kind of, Canada and Mexico, but other countries respond to the U.S. by forming agreements with the U.S., but also looking to other trading partners as well. So there's going to be a lot of change, I think, in that area driven by North American policies. And then the other topic is kind of the U.S. midterms that happen in November 2026. And so, the outcome of those elections will have a significant influence of the policy and regulatory direction, so create some uncertainty. What I think is important for our viewers, right, and as we talk with clients, is that no matter the outcome of that scenario, right, whichever scenario, there's likely going to be, continuing kind of change in policy and uncertainty there. And so, similar to some of these other regions, right, there's a really important, need to focus on changing norms of institutions that we're seeing both in the U.S. and kind of North America more broadly. Two, kind of a reassessment of supply chains and looking at operating models, but also really looking at and challenging norms and making sure that companies are ready for deregulation, right, and understanding what that means for strategy. And so the question really, I think, becomes for North America is how do you operate both locally and globally, and what does it mean to be a multinational, whether you're based in North America, but how do you operate globally despite all of this volatility and uncertainty?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So I think whilst perhaps the volatility might go down a little bit as some of the contours are clearer, are clearer. There's clearly still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of sort of big events coming, I think, in North America in the next year or so. So again, definitely a region and an area that's worth watching. So listen, I hope you enjoyed that tour of the globe and four different regions. And I would stress that whilst we've identified those four regions as really interesting and really kind of uncertain in the current environment, that's not to say that obviously those countries outside those regions aren't both really important on the global stage, but also will be impacted by all of the issues that we've been talking about today as well. And so these issues are very relevant for all of us, whatever region or country that we are operating in. So I'm going to turn back to Courtney now. So Courtney, you've heard from our colleagues around the world, and it's always really interesting to talk through these outlooks, and we always have our 10 issues and so on that people are often really interested by. But we aim not just to be interesting, but also to be useful as well. And so perhaps I can come back to you to say, look, we've run this exercise for many years now. We use it a lot with different organizations, but tell us something about how you see different organizations. Those might be businesses, they might be government departments or other public sector entities. How do we think they should use this outlook to kind of help them navigate this world?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a question we get all the time, obviously. So I think one way to use it is just to sort of keep in mind those high level themes that we discussed that I talked about earlier and that sort of were articulated in each of the regions that we just sort of toured. Keep those in mind sort of as you're making decisions throughout the year, because they really do sort of frame how the global operating environment is likely to evolve. And we've seen this over the past several years of our outlooks. As you mentioned, this is our 8th edition. And we've really been able to track those key themes over the years. And oftentimes they build, one year kind of builds to the next year. So it's not a wholly new operating environment each year, which I guess is a little bit of the good news. But in each edition, we also include some practical steps that leaders can take to build a more robust strategy for an uncertain world. So this year, for 2026, we highlight 3 actions in particular. First is to build resilience by preparing for the unexpected. So here, we're really talking in large part about scenario planning, which is something that we've seen a lot of clients really embrace over the past several years, both at the executive level as well as at the board level. So really embedding scenario planning and risk appetite frameworks and related strategies into both risk management and strategic planning will be important. Second is something that Famke was mentioning a bit, is reassessing who should be involved in geostrategy governance at your organization. So what we've seen in the past several years is that, sort of a siloed organization or a standalone siloed team doesn't really get the job done. So what organizations really need to do is assemble a cross-functional team to manage geopolitical risk. So that can include departments like public policy, risk, general counsel, operations, finance, and increasingly importantly, the technology function as well. And then third is really around adapting supply chains and global strategy to make sure that the organization's overall strategy is really attuned to geopolitics to enable leaders to make consistent decisions on where to invest, where to exit, and how to shape their operations and supply chains. One of the things that we've been noticing in the past year or so is that a lot more companies and organizations are exploring whether localization or regionalization might be resilient strategies in this geopolitical environment. But whatever the appropriate strategy is for a particular organization, the goal is really to move away from constant cycles of reaction to really rethink their proactive strategic positioning. And so we're hoping that our geostrategic outlook helps them do that.
Thank you, Gordon. I couldn't agree more with that last point, which is this shift from being reactive to proactive. And I think as I mentioned those contours, is that yes, it's uncertain, yes, it's volatile, but the contours of change in the global environment are becoming clearer. And this is definitely a time to shift from being reactive to proactive in this environment, to build, as we call it, a geo strategy. So thank you, Courtney, for those last comments. So, thank you to all of my colleagues for joining me from around the world today. We've really enjoyed listening to your perspective. And most importantly of all, thank you all for watching today and for the comments and that have been coming through in the chat. Please do watch out for the full 2026 Geostrategic Outlook, which you can access on our website from today. And obviously, please do get in touch if you would like to discuss what this means for your business or your public sector organization. So thank you all very much indeed, and have a good rest of the day.